January 1991, Los Angeles. 3 weeks before the most important performance of her career, Whitney Houston sat in a recording studio listening to NFL executives tell her that her voice was wrong for America. The Super Bowl was coming. The nation was at war. And the most powerful sports organization in the world had just one message for the greatest vocalist of her generation: sing it their way, or don't sing it at all. What those executives didn't know was that Whitney Houston had already made her choice, and it was about to change the national anthem forever. This is the story of the 2 minutes that almost didn't happen, the controversy that nearly destroyed a legend, and the moment when one woman's refusal to compromise created the most iconic performance in Super Bowl history. If you're ready to discover what really happened behind the scenes of the performance that moved a nation to tears, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this story will show you the price of perfection and the power of staying true to your art. October 1990. Whitney Houston was at the absolute peak of her career. Her album, I'm Your Baby Tonight, had just been released, and she was the undisputed queen of pop music. 3 consecutive #1 albums, 7 consecutive #1 singles, a voice that critics called once in a generation. When the NFL called her management team with an invitation to sing the national anthem at Super Bowl XXV, it seemed like a perfect match. America's biggest sporting event, America's biggest voice. But Whitney's musical director, Ricky Minor, knew this wouldn't be a typical performance. The country was on the brink of war. 10 days before the scheduled game, Operation Desert Storm had launched, sending American troops to the Persian Gulf. The Super Bowl wasn't just going to be a football game. It was going to be a statement of American strength and patriotism in the face of international conflict. The pressure was immense, and everyone knew that whoever sang that anthem would be performing for a nation holding its breath. Whitney wanted to do something special. She had grown up listening to Marvin Gaye's revolutionary 1983 rendition of the anthem at the NBA All-Star Game, where he had transformed the traditional march into a soulful, bluesy masterpiece. She wanted to honor that tradition while creating something uniquely her own. So she and Ricky Minor began working on an arrangement that would slow down the tempo, incorporate gospel and jazz elements, and give Whitney room to showcase the full power and vulnerability of her voice. The arrangement was stunning. Instead of the traditional 3/4 waltz time, they changed it to 4/4, slowing the tempo and allowing Whitney to stretch out her notes, to add runs and flourishes, to make the anthem breathe in ways it had never breathed before. When they recorded the demo version, everyone in the studio knew they had created something extraordinary. This wasn't just a national anthem. This was a spiritual experience. But when they sent the recording to the NFL for approval, the response was immediate and devastating. The executives hated it. They thought it was too slow, too different, too risky. According to Ricky Minor, the NFL officials told them the arrangement was sacrilegious, that the harmonies were too different, that Whitney's approach was simply too much for the occasion. America was at war, they argued, and this was not the time for artistic experimentation. They wanted the anthem sung the traditional way, the safe way, the way it had always been done. The NFL gave Whitney and her team an ultimatum: record a standard version in B-flat, the traditional key and tempo, or they would find someone else to perform. For most artists, this would have been the end of the conversation. The NFL was offering national exposure to a television audience that would exceed 100 million people. You didn't say no to the NFL. You didn't challenge their authority. You did what they asked, collected your check, and moved on. But Whitney Houston wasn't most artists, and she had someone in her corner who wasn't about to let the NFL dictate how his daughter would use her voice. John Houston, Whitney's father and manager, had spent his life fighting for his daughter's artistic vision. He had watched her navigate the racism and sexism of the music industry. He had seen her compromise and adapt when necessary, but he also knew when it was time to stand firm. This was one of those moments. The confrontation between John Houston and the NFL executives became legendary in the music industry. According to people who were present during the negotiations, John made it clear that Whitney would perform the anthem her way or not at all. He reminded them that they had invited Whitney Houston, not some generic singer who would follow orders. They wanted the best voice in America, and the best voice in America came with artistic integrity. The NFL was in a difficult position. It was now late January, less than a week before the Super Bowl. If Whitney walked away, they would have to find a replacement on impossibly short notice. And everyone in the entertainment industry knew that there was simply no one who could match what Whitney Houston could deliver. Her voice was unparalleled. Her star power was unmatched. And despite their reservations about the arrangement, the executives knew that Whitney's performance could be something truly special. But there was another factor at play that the public didn't know about. The NFL had decided, for technical reasons, that the anthem would be pre-recorded. The sound of the crowd, the military jets flying overhead, the impossibility of getting proper audio levels in a stadium packed with 73,000 screaming fans, all of these factors made a live performance too risky. They wanted a clean, perfect recording that could be played over the stadium's sound system, while Whitney sang along to her own voice. This decision gave Whitney and her team leverage. If the anthem was going to be pre-recorded anyway, there was no technical reason it couldn't be done in Whitney's arrangement. The NFL's objections were purely aesthetic and political. They were afraid that a slowed-down, gospel-influenced anthem would be seen as unpatriotic or inappropriate during wartime. But John Huston argued the opposite. In a time of war, he said, Americans needed to feel something. They needed to be moved. And Whitney's version would move them, in ways the traditional march never could. The standoff continued for days. The NFL recorded their safety version, the standard arrangement in B-flat, just in case Whitney refused to comply. But as the game approached, the executives realized they had a choice to make. They could play it safe with a backup singer and a forgettable anthem, or they could trust Whitney Houston to deliver something extraordinary. Finally, with just 72 hours before kickoff, they made their decision. Whitney could sing her version, but there was a catch. If anything went wrong, if the performance was criticized, or if the public reaction was negative, the NFL would make it clear that this had been Whitney's choice, not theirs. She would take the full responsibility and the full blame. Whitney accepted those terms without hesitation. She had fought for her artistic vision, and now she had the chance to prove that her instincts were right. But as she prepared to fly to Tampa for the game, she had no idea that the controversy over her arrangement was nothing compared to what was waiting for her at the stadium. January 27, 1991. Tampa Stadium, Florida. Whitney Houston arrived at the venue 12 hours before kickoff for what should have been a routine sound check and rehearsal. But the moment she stepped out of her car, she realized this was unlike any performance she had ever done. The security presence was overwhelming. Military helicopters circled overhead. Bomb-sniffing dogs patrolled every entrance. NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue had arrived wearing a flak jacket. The Goodyear blimp, a Super Bowl tradition, had been grounded because it was considered too easy a target for a terrorist attack. The Gulf War was only 10 days old, and the fear of retaliatory attacks on American soil was real and pervasive. Intelligence agencies had warned that major public events could be targets, and the Super Bowl, with its massive crowd and live television coverage, was the most visible American event imaginable. Security officials conducted multiple sweeps of the stadium. Every bag was searched. Every person was screened. Military sharpshooters were positioned on the stadium roof. Whitney was escorted to her dressing room by a security detail that included both private guards and military personnel. The atmosphere was tense, almost surreal. This wasn't the celebratory, energetic environment she was used to before major performances. This felt more like a military operation than a football game. And as she sat in her dressing room, preparing mentally and vocally for the performance, she began to understand the true weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just about singing a song. This was about representing a nation at war, about giving comfort to families who had loved ones in danger overseas, about embodying American strength and resolve in the face of uncertainty and fear. The pressure was immense, almost crushing. And then, 2 hours before the performance, something happened that made everything worse. A member of the NFL's security team knocked on Whitney's dressing room door with urgent news. There had been a credible threat assessment regarding the stadium. While no specific attack had been identified, the security level had been raised to maximum alert. Whitney was told that if she felt uncomfortable proceeding with the performance, contingency plans were in place. They could play a recording. They could have someone else perform. They could even skip the anthem entirely and move directly to the game. For a moment, Whitney considered it. The fear was real. The danger was real, and she had nothing to prove to anyone. She was already one of the most successful artists in the world. Walking away from this performance wouldn't damage her career. If anything, people would understand. But then she thought about the soldiers watching from Saudi Arabia. She thought about the families in the stadium who needed something to believe in. She thought about the millions of people who would be watching from home, looking for a moment of beauty and unity in the midst of chaos and division. And she thought about the fight she had just won with the NFL executives. She had insisted on singing the anthem her way because she believed that her version could do something the traditional arrangement couldn't. It could make people feel. It could move them. It could remind them why they loved their country, not because of military might or political power, but because of the shared values and common humanity that bound them together. If she walked away now, all of that would be lost. Whitney told the security team she would perform as planned, but she made one request. She wanted a few minutes alone to prepare herself mentally and spiritually for what was coming. The team cleared her dressing room, and Whitney did something she had done before every major performance since the beginning of her career. She called her mother. Whitney Houston had been Whitney's vocal coach, mentor, and spiritual anchor throughout her entire life. A gospel singer with a career that spanned decades, Sissy understood the power of music to heal, to inspire, and to transform. When Whitney called her from the dressing room in Tampa, Sissy could hear the fear and uncertainty in her daughter's voice. Whitney told her mother about the security situation, about the pressure she was feeling, about her doubts. And Sissy, in her characteristic no-nonsense style, told her daughter exactly what she needed to hear. This wasn't about Whitney Houston, the superstar. This wasn't about record sales or career achievements or proving anything to the NFL executives. This was about using the gift God had given her to serve something larger than herself. Sissy reminded Whitney of the power of the national anthem itself, not as a political statement or a patriotic requirement, but as a song about resilience, about surviving darkness and emerging into light, about a flag still flying after a night of bombardment. That's what people needed to hear right now, Sissy said. They needed to know that no matter how dark things seemed, no matter how much fear and uncertainty they faced, they would survive. They would endure. And the flag would still be there in the morning. When Whitney hung up the phone, she felt centered and ready. She understood now what this performance was really about. It wasn't about her voice, as incredible as that voice was. It wasn't about the arrangement, as beautiful as it was. It was about being a vessel for something larger, about using her art to give people hope and strength when they needed it most. She spent the next hour in vocal warm-ups and prayer, preparing her instrument and her spirit for the most important 2 minutes of her professional life. And when the production assistant knocked on her door to tell her it was time, Whitney Houston walked out of that dressing room transformed. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. All that remained was purpose and power. The scene on the field before Whitney's performance was a kaleidoscope of patriotism and military precision. Every seat in the stadium had a small American flag placed on it. The entire Florida orchestra stood in full dress uniform on the field. Honor guards from each branch of the military stood at attention. And over everything, there was a sense of collective breath-holding, as if the entire nation was pausing to see what would happen next. When Whitney walked onto the platform, she was dressed in a simple white tracksuit with red and blue accents. No elaborate gown, no theatrical costume, just comfortable athletic wear that made her look like one of the fans in the stands rather than a global superstar. This choice, made deliberately, sent a message. She wasn't there to perform for the crowd. She was there to perform with them, as an American, as someone who shared their fears and hopes and love for their country. The opening notes of the Florida orchestra filled the stadium, and Whitney began to sing. From the first phrase, it was clear that this was going to be something extraordinary. Her voice was pure power controlled by perfect technique. Every note was precisely placed. Every run was executed with flawless precision. But more than technical skill, there was emotion. There was vulnerability. There was soul. As she sang about the dawn's early light and the twilight's last gleaming, her voice soared and dipped, painting a picture of that historic night when Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment of Fort McHenry and wondered if his country would survive. When she reached the phrase about the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air, her voice exploded with controlled power that made the hair stand up on every person's arms. In the stands, 73,000 people stood in absolute silence, many with tears streaming down their faces. The television cameras captured reaction shots of fans, soldiers in uniform, children, elderly veterans, all of them mesmerized by what they were hearing. This wasn't just a performance. This was a moment of collective catharsis, a release of all the fear and tension and uncertainty that had been building since the war began. Whitney's musical choices, the ones the NFL executives had fought so hard against, proved to be exactly right. The slowed tempo gave people time to actually hear and understand the lyrics, many of which they had sung countless times without ever really listening to. The gospel inflections reminded them of the spiritual foundation of American ideals. The jazz elements added sophistication and depth. And Whitney's voice, that incredible, once-in-a-generation instrument, tied it all together into something that transcended music and became pure emotion. When she reached the final phrase, holding the word brave for 8 full seconds, the entire stadium erupted. The ovation was deafening, overwhelming. People who had come to watch a football game found themselves crying, hugging strangers, waving their flags with renewed passion and pride. The television cameras showed Whitney's face as she acknowledged the crowd's response, and you could see that she was crying too, moved by the power of the moment she had just created. What happened next became the subject of controversy that would follow Whitney for years. As the television broadcast replayed her performance and the initial reports began to circulate, some media outlets noticed something that seemed off about the audio. The sound was too perfect, too clean, too precisely balanced. Within days, the story broke. Whitney Houston had lip-synced to a pre-recorded version of the anthem. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Critics accused Whitney of fraud, of deceiving the American public, of being a fake. Radio talk shows dedicated hours to debating whether lip-syncing the national anthem during wartime was unpatriotic. Newspaper editorials questioned her integrity. Some people even suggested that her performance should be stricken from the record, treated as if it had never happened. The attacks were particularly painful because they struck at the heart of what Whitney valued most, her authenticity as a vocalist. She had spent her entire career proving that her voice was real, that the power and beauty people heard on her records was genuinely hers. And now, at the moment of her greatest triumph, she was being called a fake. What made the controversy even more frustrating was that it was based on a misunderstanding of what had actually happened. Yes, the audio heard by the television audience and the stadium crowd was the pre-recorded version. But Whitney had sung live into a dead microphone during the performance. She wasn't pretending to sing while a recording played. She was actually singing, giving the same emotional, technically perfect performance, while the pre-recorded audio played through the speakers. The decision to use the pre-recording had been made by the NFL and the broadcast network, not by Whitney. As Ricky Minor later explained, there were simply too many variables in a live stadium performance. The crowd noise, the military jets that flew over during the final phrase, the impossibility of getting proper microphone levels in that environment, all of these factors made a truly live broadcast impractical. Every major performer who sang the anthem at major sporting events used some form of audio support or pre-recording. But because Whitney's performance was so powerful, so memorable, it attracted scrutiny that other performances never received. Whitney was devastated by the criticism. She felt that she had given everything she had to that performance, that she had fought for her artistic vision, that she had created something beautiful and meaningful. And now, instead of being celebrated, she was being attacked. Her publicist released statements explaining the technical realities of stadium performances. Ricky Minor gave interviews defending the decision, but the controversy refused to die. Finally, 2 weeks after the Super Bowl, Whitney decided to settle the question once and for all. She was scheduled to perform at a televised HBO concert called Welcome Home Heroes, honoring troops returning from the Gulf War. And she opened that concert with a completely a cappella version of the national anthem. No orchestra, no pre-recording, no audio support of any kind. Just Whitney Houston and her voice, proving to anyone who doubted that she could deliver everything people had heard at the Super Bowl, live and unadorned. The performance silenced most of her critics, but the experience left a mark on Whitney that never fully healed. She had learned a hard lesson about the price of perfection, about how the same public that lifted you up could tear you down just as quickly. And she had learned that sometimes, even when you do everything right, Even when you create something beautiful and true, people will find a way to diminish it. Despite the lip-sync controversy, Whitney Houston's Super Bowl performance became one of the most enduring and beloved renditions of the national anthem in American history. When the September 11th attacks occurred 10 years later, the recording was re-released as a charity single, with all proceeds going to firefighters and victims' families. It reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, making Whitney the first and only artist to turn the national anthem into a top 10 pop hit. The performance has been cited by every major music publication and sports organization as the gold standard for national anthem performances. ESPN ranked it number 18 in their list of the 100 greatest Super Bowl moments. Rolling Stone included it in their 25 most memorable music moments in NFL history. And countless singers, from Christina Aguilera to Beyoncé, have cited Whitney's version as the inspiration for their own attempts at the anthem. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of that performance came from the people it was meant to serve. In the years following the Super Bowl, Whitney received thousands of letters from military families, from soldiers who had watched from Saudi Arabia, from people who had been in the stadium that day. They told her that her performance had given them hope during a frightening time, that it had reminded them why they loved their country, that it had moved them to tears and made them feel less alone. One letter, from a soldier who had watched the broadcast from a military base in the desert, particularly moved Whitney. He wrote that in the midst of fear and uncertainty about whether he would survive the war, hearing her sing those words about the flag still being there after the darkness had given him something to hold on to. Her voice had been a reminder that beauty and grace and humanity still existed, even in the midst of conflict and chaos. Whitney kept that letter for the rest of her life. When she struggled with her own battles, when the pressures of fame and the demons of addiction threatened to overwhelm her, she would read it and remember that her art had mattered, that her voice had served a purpose larger than entertainment or commercial success. She had used her gift to give comfort and strength to people who needed it. And that, more than any award or achievement, was what made the performance meaningful. The fight with the NFL executives, the controversy over the lip-syncing, the pressure and fear of that day in Tampa, all of it faded into insignificance compared to the impact of those 2 minutes. Whitney Houston had created something that transcended sports and music and politics. She had created a moment of collective healing and shared humanity. And in doing so, she had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing an artist can do is refuse to compromise, to insist on doing things their way, even when the most powerful institutions in the world are telling them they're wrong. This incredible story reminds us that true art requires courage. It requires standing up for your vision even when everyone is against you. It requires believing in yourself and your gifts even when the criticism is overwhelming. Whitney Houston fought for her right to sing the national anthem her way, and in doing so, she created the most iconic performance in Super Bowl history. What dreams or visions are you compromising on because someone told you they were wrong? How can we all be more willing to fight for what we believe in, even when the odds seem impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you to stand up for your own artistic or personal vision, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more incredible stories that prove standing up for what you believe in can change the world. Till next time, remember that your voice matters, and sometimes refusing to be silenced is the most powerful thing you can do.